Okay, welcome everybody. Are we live? We are live, great. Thank you for joining us this evening we have a very exciting webinar planned, including a new panel with some terrific experts. I'm Jill Silverman. I'm one of the co-founders of the Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies, known as ACES. ACES, for those of you that aren't familiar with us, is a grassroots organization that was started to assure that ethnic studies curriculum inspires mutual respect, fights racism, and fosters balanced analysis in our schools. We're going to be listening to this panel, and if you have questions, please put them into the chat and we will get to them as many as possible toward the end of the program. To get us started, I'd like to do a quick summary, both as an introduction to some of you that are new to this topic and as a brief reminder for some of you that have been following it. And then we will be focusing on what has happened most recently and what we can do to impact this curriculum over the next 10 days. Lena, if we can open up with some slides here.
1 second. Yes.
Okay, let's go on to the next one. Tell you a little bit about, there we go. This entire issue started with a bill. Can we go back to the bill? I'm sorry. There we are. California Bill AB 2016. It created a mandate for ethnic studies to be taught in California. And if you look at the language, it was to prepare pupils to be global citizens with an appreciation for the contributions of multiple cultures. A very worthy goal and a bill that we all supported. Next slide. Where the issue got a little bit tricky is there are actually two models of ethnic studies. There is a constructive approach to ethnic studies, which emphasizes building bridges of understanding, highlights the ethnic group's contributions to our society, and encourages students to develop critical thinking skills by evaluating multiple perspectives. This is the approach that we support. An alternate approach is called critical ethnic studies, and it focuses on dividing students into an oppressor-victim paradigm, has a specific ideology and movement to, quote, challenge imperialistic, colonial, hegemonic beliefs and practices, and militant resistance as a means of social change. Unfortunately, this is the foundation that is being used under the model curriculum that has been proposed for California schools. Next slide. We'll get to the next slide. There we go. Okay, diving down a little bit more with critical ethnic studies, it aims to bring into conversation the way that concerted efforts and collectivized resistance to US imperialism ground our approaches for dismantling the neo-colonial schooling apparatus. This is what is being taught under the current curriculum. Next slide. One of the focus for those of you that have been working with us for a while, you know that we've worked very hard to try to change the guiding principles. The guiding principles are the foundation of the entire model curriculum. The current guiding principles focus more on indoctrination. We are trying to encouraging changes that would move them more towards education. If you look here, you can see the guiding principles include language that says, critique empire in history and its relationship to white supremacy, racism, and other forms of power and oppression, so forth. Challenge imperialistic, colonial, hegemonic beliefs and practices, and promote collective narratives of transformative resistance, critical hope, and radical healing. Now, some of these words actually don't sound that bad. You know, critical hope, radical healing sounded pretty good to me the first few times I read it, until I realized that these are actually words that carry a great deal of significance in the world of critical ethnic studies. And they are not really about hope and healing. They are much more about dismantling and overthrowing the current system. Next slide. The guiding principles, again, their language talks again about transformative resistance, critical hope, radical healing. An alternative to this is an ethnic studies approach which has been used in the Los Angeles Unified School District. And their guiding principle, to give you an alternative, says focus on the experiences, histories, cultures, struggles, and accomplishments of specific ethnic racial groups within American history and society, with an emphasis on truth and healing through empathy and education. Sounds pretty non-controversial to us.
And just to clarify one thing, the terms that are in bold, the transformative resistance, critical hope, and so on, sound completely innocuous. However, they are critical race theory code terms that all have to do with dismantling or overthrowing a system.
Here you see some of the role models that have been in prior drafts of the curriculum. The specific choice of individuals has gone in and out of the various drafts. So the discussion is not so much about any of these individuals, but the types of individuals which the curriculum has included. For example, Oscar Lopez Rivera, he led a paramilitary Marxist-Leninist organization responsible for over 100 bombings in US cities. What's probably more telling than who is put in, or at least as telling, is who is left out. Some amazing role models like Martin Luther King, John Lewis, advocates for peaceful change, peaceful methods of social change have been ignored in this curriculum and overlooked and excluded. And that, we think, speaks volumes. Next slide, please. Thanks to a lot of the comments that people have sent in, there were many requests to add these seminal non-militant role models to the list or provide criteria for the list that would be included as role models. Because there was so much pushback, the entire lesson plan got removed. The good news is it got rid of most of these militant figures. The problem is the ideology that created this list is still the framework of the curriculum. So unless the framework and the guidelines are changed, there is nothing to prevent that lesson plan from coming back and from those militant people becoming the subject of in the classroom again. Next slide, please. So some sample changes in draft 4. Those of you that have been following this want to know what's new. Specifically, the LAUSD course, which we have held up as an example of a constructive ethnic studies approach, was taken off of the list of courses in the curriculum, referenced in the curriculum. Alternatively, the courses, the more radical courses, they were left in there. The draft expanded the recommendation of ethnic studies course to consider a set of courses or its own department in high school. So now this is now moving from a 1 semester course to potentially being multiple courses or an entire department within a high school. It keeps expanding its range. There was significant language regarding trauma. There was an actual warning in the curriculum to teachers that the course could cause trauma. And specifically, the language said, classes may evoke feelings of vulnerability, uneasiness, sadness, guilt, helplessness. So they removed those words, but they didn't change any of the content that those words referenced. Instead, they put in a footnote at the end that said, for more information about dealing with trauma in school settings, go here. So they've even acknowledged how traumatic these some of this language could be to high school students, but they don't seem concerned about eliminating the trauma, just eliminated the warning. Another change, the Arab American lesson with anti-Semitic pieces was added at the very last minute without an opportunity for review or comment. Next slide, please. And this was a good one too. There was a language in a previous draft. Our many commenters were successful in getting a statement of balance to the curriculum. And it said, curriculum resources and materials should include a balance of topics, authors, and concepts, including primary and secondary sources that represent multiple and sometimes opposing points of view or perspectives. This was great. In this fourth draft, they changed the word opposing to distinctive. So where we were very proud that the curriculum was going to encourage multiple perspectives to be debated and acknowledged, now it is back to presenting one side, one perspective, one vision of the world. Next slide. Here were some of the requests that we made that were ignored. Change the instruction for students from discussing political contributions to anti-imperial and anti-colonial movements to discussing contributions to society and politics in general. We asked that they replace critique empire building in history and its relationship to white supremacy, racism, and other forms of power and oppression with examine how race and ethnicity have been constructed in the United States and continue to shape the country today. We also, they didn't do that. And another one they didn't do, we asked them to replace promotes collective narratives of transformative resistance, critical hope, and radical healing. As you remember, those are all code words for resistance, with focus on the experiences, histories, cultures, struggles, and accomplishments of specific ethnic racial groups with American history and society, within American history and society. So what we thought were very reasonable requests have been continuously ignored. Next slide. Is that the end of these slides? Okay, that's the end of our introduction. Great. So with that, I would like to move on, and what you have all been waiting for is to introduce our phenomenal panelists today, who are going to share a range of perspectives on the curriculum. Brandy Shufentinsky, I'm sorry, I've crucified her name too many times. Shufentinsky is a social worker with an MSW from the University of Southern California and a master's in international relations from the University of San Diego. She founded Black Americans for Inclusive Ethnic Studies to combat bigotry, specifically within educational institutions. Brandy's interests rest in supporting intercultural opportunities to advance industry and inclusivity in academic settings. She's a doctoral candidate in international and multicultural education at University of San Francisco. Our second panelist, Mo Ceballos, was born in Ecuador. He came to the United States as a child and served with distinction in the US Army. He has both bachelor's and master's degrees in management engineering, both during and since his very successful career in asset management. He's been very involved in his community, a significant supporter and mentor to the San Francisco City Academy for K-8 school and STEM lab development in San Francisco's Tenderloin. He is co-founder of Latinx for Quality Education, an organization which supports curriculum which empower Latino youth. Wenyun Wu is the executive director of Californians for Equal Rights Foundation. She previously served as executive director of the successful No on 16 campaign and director of administration of the Asian American Coalition for Education. She has a doctorate in international studies from the University of Miami and authored the book Chinese Oil Enterprises in Latin America, Corporate Social Responsibility. She's been interviewed by many prominent sources, including the Wall Street Journal, NBC News, the Boston Globe, and has been published in Cal Matters, Orange County Register, and many others. And our fourth panelist, Alina Kaplan, a co-founder of ACES, has managed nonprofit organizations for over a decade. She has served on over a dozen Jewish boards and committees, including Lamud Bay Area, Jewish Day Schools, Bureau of Jewish Education, Jewish Family and Children's Services, Jewish Community Relations Council, and multiple Jewish Community Federation committees. Prior to her nonprofit roles, she worked in the high-tech industry. She has an MBA from Stanford and Bachelor of Science in Math and Computer Science from Duke. We're going to begin, and I'd like to welcome our panelists and thank all of them for spending time this evening to share their thoughts. We'd like to start by asking each of them why this curriculum is important to them and what are their concerns and hopes regarding its outcomes. And I'd like Brandy, if you would start us off, please.
And I'm just going to step in for one moment, folks. We're getting comments that the chat is not enabled. So if you could put your comments, your questions into the Q&A, please, we will address them as they come in.
I want to start by saying thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. As far as my connection and my concerns regarding the curriculum, I have two main concerns and related hopes regarding this ethnic studies model curriculum. One's personal and one's professional. I'll start with the personal one. I'm a proud product of the California public school system. I attended California public schools K through 12 and went on to pursue higher education well prepared. That's a courtesy not only to my hard work, but also to the hardworking and dedicated teachers and supportive administrators. I benefited from being introduced to a diversity of thought, diverse educators, and diversity of curricula as a student. However, I knew then, as I know now, that not every student had a similar experience. I was well aware that some textbooks were not representative of the deep, rich stories that make up the fabric of the United States of America. I acknowledge that my experience was in part due to teachers and administrators being creative with source material, and I'm grateful to them for thinking outside of the box. Exposure to stories and experiences of those who look like me and those who come from different communities enhanced my knowledge and also added to my intellectual curiosity. As a student, I did not know my teacher's political leanings, and I should not have. This enabled me to feel safe expressing my opinions and analyze materials without fear of retribution if my opinion differed from that of my teacher. The ESMC does not allow for this type of learning environment because it's presented in a very specific, narrow, and politicized framework. Professionally, I'm aware of how enhancing curricula to reflect the communities in which students live and learn positively benefits the learning environment. Representation matters. However, representation cannot and should not come at the expense of a constructive learning environment. The goal of ethnic studies should be implemented in an additive framework where the histories, experiences, and cultures of those previously excluded or minimized from curricula are studied. Ethnic studies also should include the study of intergroup relations, and there are times when this will be uncomfortable, and educators and administrators should be prepared and supported when managing uncomfortable conversations. However, students should never have to pay the price for these conversations. In its current state, the ESMC does not provide guardrails nor the framework necessary to ensure a safe and healthy learning environment. We live in the unfortunate reality where school bullying has led to numerous incidents of violence, including self-harm. Framing any curricula in an us versus them lens has the potential to be a source of violence and discrimination. My hope is that this is not a missed opportunity to enhance student learning, diversify curricula, and spark, support, and encourage curiosity. I hope that Black American students are able to feel proud of our community, culture, and heritage, and learn about other cultures to become better global thinkers and global leaders. I hope that non-Black students are able to learn about the rich and diverse communities that make up Black America, and I hope that this is fulfilled in a manner that is constructive, additive, and inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brandy. Appreciate that. I think we'll have some comments later. Mo, same question to you.
Wow. Kind of a
Tough act to follow.
kind of a hard answer to follow. Brandy, that was spectacular because it reminded me of how happy and joyous I was as an 8-year-old in the New York City public school system, where Mauricio became Mo because it was easy to say. and allowed me to play punchball with the rest of the kids. It made it really easy to go through PS 192 and junior high school 43, very near Harlem. I was an Ecuadorian, but I didn't really know that that made me different from anybody around me. The people that I grew up with were struggling. Their families were working 2 and 3 jobs, as was my mom. My mom was a 28-year-old when she left Ecuador, and she left me behind and brought me 2 years later. You know, that story gets repeated generationally over and over. So it isn't worth spending time, but it is worth celebrating her as my first hero, my first role model. Beginning with my mom, positive role models have served to teach me that neither gender nor ethnic background were limits in life. Now, I happen to have stolen that little phrase from someone that I discovered as I started to figure out how could I battle what's going on in this curriculum. And I discovered Ellen Ochoa. I didn't know Ellen Ochoa. Ellen Ochoa is a female astronaut. She's of Mexican heritage. She was born here in America. And Ellen is the kind of role model that I would like to see highlighted in our curriculum rather than Lolita Lebron, who, along with her partners, invaded the Capitol. And we know what that has done to our country here recently, but we forget that that is, in fact, what was done by that group of nationalists. Ellen Ochoa said to us, what everyone in the astronaut corps shares in common is not gender or ethnic background, but motivation, perseverance, and the desire to participate in a voyage of discovery. These are the kind of people that need to be celebrated as role models in demonstrating the contributions not only of Mexican Americans, but Cuban Americans, Ecuadorian Americans, Dominican Americans. That is my hope and aspiration for this curriculum, that it is more balanced. The problem with this curriculum, as I have learned talking to people when I raise the issue, is that they are aghast when they realize that 90% of it is indoctrination and 10% is education. Everyone is looking for balance in the curriculum. They're looking for stories of resilience and hope and the ability to overcome difficult circumstances, but also to celebrate the accomplishments of many, many people in the Latinx community in many fields besides being astronauts. I highlight Miss Ochoa. I highlight my mom. I highlight people like Victoria Solano, who is a writer and recently wrote a book that just blew me away, Dominicana. And for me, if I were a girl, that would be a book that would just light me up if I was a Dominican. So I don't need a Marxist-Leninist warrior to show me the way to success and joy. I'd rather have a much broader and balanced curriculum. I think this curriculum is totally indoctrinating and one-sided. And quite frankly, the language is not even understandable. We just saw some of the examples of the words that we tried to suggest changes for and had no success. So those are, my hopes and my concerns with the curriculum as it stands right now and what I'd like to see changed.
Thank you very much. That was great. Wenyun, would you like to answer the same question? We're getting some fascinating perspectives here.
Yeah, absolutely, certainly. And thank you, Jill, for introducing me. Huge appreciation to ACES again for organizing this very timely event. It's a pleasure to join you, Brandy and Mo, tonight. This topic is important to me both personally and in my professional capacity at Californians for Equal Rights Foundation. We are a nonpartisan and nonprofit organization dedicated to the cause of equal rights. It's important to me for three main reasons. First, I think teaching ethnic studies in a way that is predicated on racial divisions and a social dichotomy of victim versus oppressor fundamentally violates the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, which guarantees equal protection of the laws. Title VI and VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibited racial discrimination in both employment and educational access in federally funded programs. It also violates California's constitutional principle of equal treatment and a plethora of anti-discrimination laws. In November 2020, let us remember, over 9.6 million California voters resoundingly rejected Proposition 16, which would have revived preferential treatment and discrimination on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. Instituting ethnic studies in a framework of critical ethnic studies or critical pedagogy violates this very principle of equal treatment for all. And second, not only is this process potentially unconstitutional and illegal, indoctrinating a whole generation of innocent kids on perceived and often exaggerated race-based differences is a disservice to the entire society. This fourth draft of ethnic studies model curriculum contains some window dressing improvements to passively address public criticisms, as Jill had pointed out, but it is still very much and fundamentally rooted in critical race theory with an ideological obsession to promote a radical political propaganda that divides students into rival groups of power and of privilege on one hand versus oppression and victimhood on the other hand. It attacks social cohesion and stokes racial animosity. And lastly, we're talking about a sweeping ethnic studies movement that is starting in California. And in my humble opinion, this is a very deliberate decoy to create diversions and smokescreens from the real problems, to cover up decades of policy failures in California's public education. Over 60%, and I repeat, over 60% of California students, grades 3 to 11, cannot do math proficiently, and only 50% can read proficiently. And there is a persistent racial achievement gap, especially in inner cities, in large school districts like San Diego, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Learning gaps and loss have also been exacerbated by the pandemic, with a disproportionate impact on low-income or disadvantaged students. California's educational authorities on both state and local levels are gambling away our academic competitiveness with debunked claims of ethnic studies having any educational or emotional benefits. Sure, it's much easier to indoctrinate, antagonize, and engage in social engineering than actually doing the hard work of improving academic instruction for our state. I am particularly concerned about the stubborn refusal of the State Board of Education and the Department of Education to make any real effort to revise and create an ethnic studies model curriculum that would comply with the State Board of Education's guidelines, or even meaningfully address mounting criticisms regarding this critical ethnic studies framework. So we're now on the cusp of witnessing a deeply problematic and foundationally political model curriculum debuting in public at the end of this month. What's equally concerning is the fact that many local districts are already implementing previously rejected versions of ethnic studies model curriculum in their schools, being sold the snake oil of critical ethnic studies. But I also have tremendous hope for our opposition. There has been an organic and bipartisan movement to challenge the practices and assumptions of critical ethnic studies and critical race theories throughout the country and our state. California is a key battleground in this fight, and I commend everyone here and our diverse allies for mobilizing, speaking up, and exposing the immorality of the other side. The good news is that we're actually right. We're on the right side of the history and on the side of prevailing public opinions. According to a recent survey conducted by the Heritage Foundation, while 14,000 public schools throughout the United States are embracing critical race theory, 50% of all parents and 70% of school board members said they do not want schools to use the instruction materials rooted in the idea that slavery is the center of the national narrative. So we're gaining momentum. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope some of you are as awed by this panel as I am. Alina, you want to give us a fourth angle on that same question, please?
Sure. Well, speaking of being awed, first of all, I really, truly am also awed by being in a panel with these folks. And I was just thinking as everybody was talking that 3 of us here are immigrants, 3 of us are people of color, and among us, we cover a full spectrum of political views. But it's pretty amazing that we all agree on one thing, which is that the ESMC needs to be fixed for the sake of our future. So yesterday I came across this quote from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who wrote that the single most important social institution is the place where we hand our values to the next generation, where we tell our children where we've come from, what ideals we fought for, and what we learned on the way. And I guess it stuck with me because that's probably the core of why this issue is so important to me as a Jew, but also as a Californian, as an American, and as an immigrant. Ethnic studies sounded to me like a great subject to teach. It still sounds to me like a great subject to teach, especially important at this time of polarization that we're experiencing in this country. To teach kids what is important to and in various ethnic groups, how they have contributed to build this country, and how we can all work together to bring about positive change. When I first started reading tidbits here and there on the ESMC, I was startled by some blatantly anti-Semitic parts. So there was, as some of you know, there was a poem referring to Jews controlling the media, something about the founding of Israel being referred to as the Nakba, which means catastrophe. But the question I had was, where in the world is this coming from? So I stopped sort of jumping around in this 600-page document and looked at the introduction, the very beginning, and the guiding principles. And then looked at where did those principles come from? Because some of them, as you probably saw as Jill was speaking at the beginning, sound like a really bizarre thing to come after the objective of teaching kids about contributions of each other's ethnic groups. So it turns out that anti-Zionism is a core part of the critical ethnic studies movement that you were learning about earlier in Jill's presentation. In fact, after the US, Israel is actually considered by that movement the second worst colonial state, erasing 3,000 years of Jewish history in the land of Israel. So yes, I am startled by the anti-Semitic references and the calls for students to say participate in the BDS movement, that stands for the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, that seeks to delegitimize the state of Israel. But honestly, I'm more horrified by the framework and the ideology that brings forth this anti-Semitism and opens the door to many forms of division and bigotry. And because the ESMC is a model curriculum, it's not good enough to remove certain words here and there. What's most important is to ensure that the overall framework, as guided by the values and principles, is a constructive one. I also have to share the connection between Marxist ideology and anti-Semitism, because that is a personal one for me. As an immigrant from the former Soviet Union, it all sounds just a little bit too familiar. I was only a preteen when I immigrated, but I'd already been learning in school some of the concepts, and the vague sense of deja vu in reading the ESMC, in any of the drafts of the ESMC, including this last one, is really quite disturbing. In terms of my hopes, from the big picture for the ESMC, I would like to see a curriculum that builds those bridges of understanding and empathy and unites rather than forcing a particular ideology and dividing. My hopes in the short term are that the State Board of Education makes important changes, especially to the guiding principles, and then carry those changes throughout to come closer to that vision. Back to you, Jill.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much. Thank you, all four of you. It's a lot to swallow. But keeping going and drilling down a little bit more, I'd like to individualize a few questions, because you've all raised some great, very, very deep and thoughtful points. Brandy, I know that in the past you've written about self-determination for Black Americans, and I'm wondering, how does that fit, or should it fit, with the model curriculum?
Thank you for asking that. It's unfortunate when, at a time that Black American students are grappling with underfunded and under-resourced schools, a curriculum that has the potential to uplift and support these students is choosing to frame Black Americans as victims. We are not victims. Yes, we've been victimized, but more than that, we've survived. The current draft of the ESMC is framed in a critical race theory lens. The lack of academic diversity this lens uses is harmful to learning because it utilizes the same all or nothing, us versus them approach that has been so prevalent in Eurocentric academic materials. Black Americans have a level of self-determination and self-reliance that is not centered in this curriculum. There's a hyper-focus on white privilege that, while important to discuss, should not be centered in the ESMC. Understanding the roots of the movement for ethnic studies is important to discuss here. This movement was born out of non-white students being erased and marginalized in majority white learning institutions. There was a push to include Black, Asian, Indigenous, and Latin materials in what was then referred to as mainstream learning materials. This foundation should not be minimized. We should also not ignore the fact that the situation on the ground is much different than it was when this movement began decades ago. The makeup of California public school students is mostly non-white. Demographic shifts in California and the rest of the nation are becoming majority non-white. Segments of society have not seen similar patterns. Black America has a history where Black students were taught by Black teachers. Much of this changed with school integration, which is an entirely other conversation. However, it's important to note that with the decrease of Black educators and administrators, there's been a push for non-Black teachers and administrators to tell our stories. I believe that this has been a leading cause for the type of exclusivity in materials presented and sources of learning. Education, like so many other things in this country, has become politicized, with one side wanting to ignore the diversity of the US and the other wanting to celebrate that diversity, but only within the confines of a particular political narrative. The instructional guidance section of the ESMC states that the course section on Black Americans looks at, quote, the importance African Americans played in the formation of the United States, the oppression they faced, the exploitation of Black labor, and the continued fight for liberation, end quote. The concern I have with this is that it centers Black victimhood rather than celebrating Black excellence and strength. I'm not implying that there should not be no mention of the tragedies inflicted on Black Americans, just that it should not be the center of the conversation or centered in learning. Our stories and experiences are not centered in white oppression. Teaching our children this disadvantages them further by providing a false narrative that whiteness is at the center of not only Black hardships, but also Black success. Yes, we've been victimized, but we're not victims. We've been subjugated, but we are not subjects. We've been subordinated, but we're not subordinate. We should not have a curriculum that continues to victimize, subjugate, and subordinate us.
I challenge anybody to argue with that. Okay, thank you, Brandy. Mo, you have talked, and you were just talking a fair amount about role models and role models. You named your mother, you named a number of role models that you have. What criteria do you think should be used to determine which role models should be highlighted in the ethnic studies curriculum?
You know, I think that keying off of what Brandy just said, criteria which offer balance, criteria which really recognizes the breadth of contribution rather than centering on that element which has eliminated the opportunity to achieve more. It's almost as if everything we've achieved would have to have an asterisk next to it, because we want to say, well, we would have done so much more, but you didn't let us. To me, that doesn't inspire anything. That inspires anger and resentment. And so what I would like to do is make sure that the criteria is celebrating across the spectrum, celebrating the arts, the sciences. You know, when I think about the San Francisco Academy in the Tenderloin here in San Francisco, which my partner introduced me to in 2012, and who single-handedly has devoted countless hours to create an environment for children that really have no way out. And that environment has called me to be supportive of his efforts and his wife's efforts to try to find pathways for these students. And one of the things that we spent time on recently is helping them develop a STEM lab. So why would we think that they need a STEM lab? Well, because it was very easy to notice that they were starting to fall behind in 3rd and 4th grade. And the schools that had the STEM labs were moving, and these kids were being left behind. So for me, the notion of role models are sometimes not Latin role models, but the combination of a Latin, white, and Black role model that combine and bring resources, collective resources, to solve problems and to create pathways. And for me, this notion of separating groups and oppressor oppressed is just so antithetical to that idea. You know, I've spent time with a medical research facility that basically brought all of its scientists together to have the cross-fertilization of their knowledge, and it has now produced in less than 20 years 2 Nobel Prize winners. You know, this kind of stuff doesn't happen because you surround Kobe Bryant with bad players. You surround Kobe Bryant with the best players. And so to me, role models give you that inspiration to want to surround yourself with excellence, to want to emulate the people who have cleared a path, as tough as it may be. Because I don't think it was very easy for my mom to work in factories and leave behind her entire family and try to chart a new path. It wasn't easy for her. And it hasn't been easy for many, many families. But one thing I do know, that many Latinx families have left oppressive Marxist governments and left everything behind to start new here in America. We have a Cuban contingent now across many, many parts of this country in less than 2 generations that have basically proven that that system didn't work. And I should tell you that I was in Cuba when Fidel Castro took power because my mom remarried a Cuban national. So I wore black pants and a red top to celebrate the arrival of the liberator. But when I look back now, there's nothing there. And so for me, the Marxist agenda in the critical ethnic studies is something I've lived and watched in real life. It doesn't work. And to promote that with the utopian sense of you've been victimized, is really sending the wrong message. And I don't think that we'll ever improve incomes or outcomes or opportunity in the world ahead, the STEM world that lies ahead. I'd rather, as I heard when Lou talking, have my students learning about science, technology, engineering, and math than parading down the hallway yelling, Angela Davis, free Angela Davis. We know what she fought for and we know what she represented. But I don't think today is the day that we need to be spending time on that educational forum. And that's what is embedded in some of these lesson plans. And Lolita LeBron or anyone else doesn't represent to me what I would like to have my grandchildren look at. And I should tell you one last thing. I don't have grandchildren, but I have a fight here. And the fight is to preserve the equity that my mother built. That equity is embedded in me. And I want to carry that forward. I don't need children or grandchildren to defend parents and students. I'm not on the side of the educators. I'm not trying to create an organization that's going to empower educators. I want parents and students to learn how to survive in a really competitive and brutal global economy and world. And they need to be empowered. So the criteria, boy, there's so many different areas that we have leaders that we can find that will shine the inspiration that we don't know where it's going to come from. But somebody's going to see that light, and who knows, maybe the first person on the moon will be an Ecuadorian. That would be something pretty cool.
Thank you, Mo. Very moving. Wenyan, I'm going to switch gears a little bit. There's been a lot of media coverage lately about the Asian America model minority myth. And in the latest draft, there's a chapter about the Asian American model minority myth. I'd like to know what your perspective on this nuanced issue is as it pertains to this curriculum.
Certainly, I appreciate this question, Jill. I'm both baffled and somehow offended by that chapter. I read it, and the political monopolization of the Asian American model minority myth behind that chapter. Just a quick story. I distinctively recall an interview I did on Prop 16 last year. I was asked by a student journalist to summarize the Asian American perspective on that particular measure, and I laughed. So I told her it would be very arrogant and inaccurate of me to represent Asian Americans, which who are very diverse and different. And I can talk about myself, my own perspective. I'm first and foremost an American, and then I'm one of Asian descent, of Chinese descent. And I'm proud of fighting on that very important battle, fighting that battle. And just like to put that out as a fun story and also a disclaimer, and that I believe my moral conviction to be judged on the ground of my individual merit is in line with my participation in our counter movement. So going back to the latest ESMC's chapter on model minority myths, I believe it added the model minority myth lesson and defines model minority as a stereotype used to pit Asian Americans against other communities of color, particularly Black Americans. In terms of media, this particular version of the model minority myth talks about the portrayal of Asian American success in pursuing the American dream with hard work and an emphasis on education as a controlling tool to delegitimize systemic oppression and racism against Asians. We're talking about some psychological warfare here. There is a lot to unpack, but the bottom line is this: the model minority narrative is being hijacked and weaponized by woke ideologues to justify a bigger political agenda, in this case, critical ethnic studies. The flawed logic lies in conflating objective observations such as Asian Americans' general documented defiance of the victimhood narrative with this amorphous claim of systemic racism. God, I cringe every time when I hear that term without further explanation. It is deceptive and dishonest. The woke version of model minority is also incredibly hypocritical. Progressives condemn the model minority myth when it serves their agenda to sell subdivision and sob stories. Yet they don't hesitate to stereotype high-achieving Asians as unimpressive, nerdy, lacking in leadership, etc., when it comes to defend systematic anti-Asian discrimination, which is very real in selective education, such as Harvard's discrimination against high-achieving Asian applicants. That has been a national story for years. This is right up the alley of critical race theory supporters, to put Asian Americans in a bind, condemn the system of white supremacy and privilege, along with other people of color, all be banished from the victim group as white adjacent. The end goal here is to pit people against each other as if our racial and ethnic identities are bigger than our common destiny as Americans. The real question here is, and I ask everyone here attending this webinar to consider, do we as concerned citizens, investigators, and scholars engage in a collective deceit to blame all documented disparities on racism, whatever it means? Or do we challenge this as a policy issue? How do we incorporate the Asian experience as part and parcel of the American experiment of exceptionalism, merit, and individual agency? Thank you.
Thank you, Wenyan. Only because of time, there's so many things I could say, but I'm going to keep us moving and flip Elena a whole different direction. In the last few months, there's been a wide range of views expressed throughout the Jewish community about the model curriculum. Would you like to maybe comment and walk us through some of the different perspectives?
Sure, thanks, Jill, for the question. So first of all, many organizations and groups of people have worked very hard for a long time on this issue. Some of these will be familiar to some of the folks on our call: AJC, JCRC, sorry for the alphabet soup, Club Z, Jemena, AMCHA, and ultimately, we all want the same thing. We all want a bridge building curriculum that does not promote anti-Semitism or bigotry of any kind. In fact, it's kind of ironic to me that we have to worry about this, given the subject of ethnic studies, that we have to be worrying about anti-Semitism and bigotry that comes forth from this curriculum, but here we are. So although ultimately we all want the same thing, I think there are just different approaches to how we get to that point. So for example, there's a difference between some groups that are focused on specific words in the curriculum, specific sentences, specific examples, and there are groups that are focused on the framework overall. ACES is not a Jewish organization, as you can see. We have we work with groups across the entire ethnic spectrum, but we do have many Jewish constituents. And from that perspective, from all of those perspectives, our focus has been on the roots of where this bigotry, this hatred comes from, and that comes back to those guiding values and principles. So that dichotomy leads to different perspectives, a dichotomy between focusing on specifics versus on the overall picture. And you can see that, by the way, when Jill was talking about the different role models that were in the curriculum, those militant role models, the reason they were removed is because of thousands and thousands of demands and comments from people like all of you that said, we don't want these types of role models. And that was in some of the action alerts that we sent. And that's a good thing, they got removed. On the other hand, as Jill was talking about, it all comes from a very particular framework, which is still there. So that means that we can look at the recently added lesson on Arab Americans in two ways. We can look at whether or not it matters if something is spelled out in the main text, let's say. Or, and we might say that, okay, well, if it's not in the main text, that's okay, we're good. On the other hand, groups like us are looking at the whole thing holistically and looking at the textbook, for example, that is a required reading. And when we look at that textbook and we see that it is predominantly it's predominantly propagating an anti-Zionist narrative, that is a problem for us. And we might look at a citation that's in the lesson. So we will look at the citation at the bottom and we'll see where it says that the state of Israel was built on Palestinian land. We will look at that and say, okay, this is not a balanced perspective. This is a problem. It's also not historically accurate. And it's back to, again, that the issue is not the specifics for us, but rather the roadmap that is being provided. And to be clear, by the way, on that Arab American lesson that was added at the last minute and wasn't vetted, I should add that we have absolutely no problem, of course, with teaching about Arab Americans. In fact, we think we should be teaching about Arab Americans just as we should be teaching about Jewish Americans. The issue is what's in the actual lessons. Another aspect is a focus on an inclusive curriculum. So there are many organizations that focused early on the fact that Jews were left out altogether out of an ethnic studies curriculum, which seemed kind of crazy. And so many focused on that. Unlike ACES, which is really focused on, again, that framework. So to us, the leaving out of Jews and anti-Semitism from an ethnic studies curriculum is deeply offensive, but the overall framework is what is dangerous. Now, thanks to support from many of you, changes have been made with respect to including Jews in the curriculum. And for example, Jemena, one of the organizations that argued for including a unit on Mizrahi Jews, these are Jews that come from Middle East and North Africa, accomplished getting a lesson added to the curriculum. So that's a good thing. Now, some organizations have used a blend of approaches in addressing both balance and inclusion. So for instance, Stand With Us and AJC have both focused on including Jewish Americans. In fact, AJC created a coalition of organizations to insist that lessons in the ESMC are inclusive. So now Sikhs, Armenians, Koreans, and other organizations have been added to the curriculum. But both AJC and Stand With Us really look at the inclusion issue and also the balance aspect of the curriculum. Another one is, believe it or not, the definition of anti-Semitism. It doesn't seem like that should be a complicated one, and yet it is in the case of the ESMC. There's a standard definition by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, goes by IHRA or IHRA. It includes a general description of bigotry against the Jews, and it also includes anti-Semitism from the right and the left as part of the definition. It also includes a list of examples. So for instance, denying the Jewish people their right, I'm quoting from it, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination and denying Israel the right to exist is an example listed in the definition. You can only get to that definition if you go to the actual link and see it as part of it. Now, the ESMC has removed the link from the definition of anti-Semitism in the curriculum. So currently there is just a truncated definition that's a general definition saying that anti-Semitism is bigotry against, basically something like discrimination against the Jews. And it's a general definition and doesn't go into the really meaningful part, the meaty part of the definition. This definition, by the way, has been endorsed by both departments of education, the State Department, almost all countries in the Western Hemisphere, the Global Council of Imams, but sadly not the ESMC. So a lot of discussion has been around the definition of anti-Semitism and how to get a meaningful definition of anti-Semitism and what does meaningful constitute. So there's been discussion of that. And then lastly, there are concerns from some organizations and groups about making sure that we are good allies to communities of color and wanting to be supportive of other ethnic groups. So some believe that the way to do that is to allow this curriculum to go forward mostly as is, as a way of showing important solidarity, because ethnic studies, as we started at the very beginning, is an important subject. I truly believe that the vast majority of Californians would not want this curriculum if they knew about it, including, as we're hearing here on this panel, people of color, because I think that the vast majority of Californians and Americans don't want their kids painted as oppressors or as victims. Neither one is good for the kids. So the challenge has been getting the word out, which is what we're doing tonight, and we hope that you will do as well by talking to others about this issue. The challenge is getting people to know about it, because this issue has been so under the radar that most folks, the majority of folks in California, simply don't know. It's actually stunning how little people know about the issue and how much has been under the radar. So much of the work we're doing is premised on the idea that if we shine a light on it, then we are being good allies to all ethnic groups, but making sure that we can come together. And there's no doubt in my mind that the vast majority of Californians and Americans, for that matter, would want curricula that empower, not victimize, and unite, not divide. That's sort of a summary. Jill, before I turn it over to you, I just wanted to say a couple of housekeeping things, because I'm noticing a bunch of questions on the chat. And one of them is about making sure that we get PowerPoint and the recording to people, and we will absolutely do that. There are also questions. There are so many questions right now. They're just coming nonstop, which is great. I can tell you right now, we will not be able to get through them all. So apologies to many of you that won't have your questions answered. I would encourage you to email. We'll have at the end, Jill will put up the email address, and you can email us and we'll get back to you. And then one of the other questions I'm noticing is people are wondering if they can get in touch with our panel, and feel free to email that same address and we will forward on the questions to our panelists as well. Back to you, Jill.
Thank you, Alina. And again, thank you to everyone on our panel for just tremendously thoughtful and well-presented comments. Want to, if we can share the screen a bit, we have a few more slides that we'd like to share about where can we, I think we're beyond that one. Want to talk about what happens now and where can you, how can you help? How can you make a difference with this? First of all, why is this such a big issue? And some of the questions asked, is this a required course? As of today, it is required that it be offered in all high schools, but there is legislation pending in the California legislature, which will make the course a requirement. It is not clear whether it would be 1 semester or 2 semesters. There is also language where we have seen around the state, schools are beginning to implement versions of ethnic studies in K through 8, not just in high school. As mentioned before, there are discussions about making it a department in schools, and there have also been a lot of proponents that ethnic studies should be integrated into every subject in every grade, including math, including science, including things that you would not necessarily think as logical fits for this topic. National plans for ethnic studies based on the California curriculum. A lot of other states have already announced these plans, and the National Education Association, which has 3 million teachers, 300 million teachers, I don't know, 3,000, whatever, a lot of teachers. That's the National Teachers Union, and they have already announced support for this curriculum. The California Teachers Association has supported this curriculum. There's a lot of momentum for it, and so it is a very hard pushback to get it right. Next slide. What is happening here in California? The State Board of Education will vote on March 18th. It is under current law mandated that a curriculum be adopted by March 31st. If there's enough pressure, it's possible the deadline will be delayed. We know of at least a couple of other organizations that are looking not only to lobby for an extension, but exploring legal routes to require an extension, because there have been some, let's just say, unorthodox procedures with this process. But the problem is, this is a model curriculum for the state. A number of local districts are already adopting curriculum, not waiting for the state curriculum. They've had resolutions to adopt a curriculum based on the initial draft, which, as bad as this draft is, the first draft was even worse. It was the one that contained very direct anti-Semitic language, much more explicit hatred, many more revolutionary role models. Regardless of what happens, I think it's realistic to expect that this battle will continue district by district, as local school boards have the ultimate authority to determine what is taught in their schools. Next slide. So what you can do, there's a lot that can be done. Submitting letters to the school board, and if we can go back and govern, well, you want this email. So if you go to our email, ACE's email, I'm sorry, our website, on the website, there is an ACT button that will, if you click there, you can automatically put your name on a letter that will go to the state board and to Governor Newsom. This is extremely timely because, as we said, the decision is being made in a little over a week from now. So we need, actually exactly a week from now. So we need those letters to go in immediately. We invite everyone to write letters to the editor or op-eds to local papers, write to your legislators, talk to other parents and teachers to spread the word. As Alina said, one of the big challenges is that the vast majority of parents and students don't know this is happening. I've talked even with school board members in some districts that didn't know this was happening. It's amazing that such a momentous change in our educational system could go under the radar and be such a stealth movement, but it has been. So it's really important to get the word out there. If you're interested in communicating directly, on March 18th in the morning, the school board meets. There will be an opportunity to make comments, to call in with a 60-second comment, and information about that will also be on our website. And if you sign up through our website for more information, we will send you, make sure you're getting our alerts and releases as information comes out with things that you can do. Again, this is the website address and our email address if you have specific questions. And so there's been, for those of you that want to read a very, very long document, on our website, you can find a link to the complete draft, as well as links to a number of publications that have been written about the draft. So we can't get change without your involvement, without your help, without your word of mouth. Please share the information with people in your communities, your schools, your book clubs, your religious institutions, your kids' sports teams if they're playing, whatever networks you have, because that is how people find out about this, and most people who learn about it are not thrilled with the direction that it's going. With that, I'm going to open it up to questions, and I did want to give an opportunity before I did that. Actually, if there were any of our panelists that had any closing comment that they wanted to make, I'll give you that opportunity while I'm looking at some of the questions here. The slides, as Lena said, will be available.
I can start answering, Jill, while you're looking, I can start answering some of them. I think that we've got, I believe, 15 minutes and tons of questions to get through. So some folks have been asking about whether or not it is too late to do anything. And I guess I have a several-part answer to that. One of them is that with enough public pressure, there are definitely things that can be done. We're not talking about dumping the entire curriculum and rewriting the whole thing from scratch. We've made specific recommendations to the State Board of Education. We need your help propagating those. And that's why we need your help submitting your comments to both the State Board of Education and the Governor's Office. So absolutely, there are things that can be done. There are organizations that are talking about extending the deadline if there is enough pressure and the State Board of Education does not feel that it can make those changes, then that's something that they can request from the legislature. And I guess lastly, just from the big picture perspective, I don't buy into that. It's never too late. We heard it's too late starting from the very beginning of this process, starting from about, I don't know, 2019, summer 2019, there was discussion that it is too late, that this train is moving. And honestly, I think it's never too late to do the right thing. So that would be my answer to the, is it too late question. I'm gonna take off the screen share and put some of this information in the chat for those of us that are, those of you that are interested, and we'll email you the information that you're asking for in terms of the PowerPoint and the recording. Okay, Jill.
Okay. Okay, there was a question.
Jill, you're kind of coming in and out. Can you get a little closer maybe?
Yeah. Okay, there's a question here about how are individual teachers pressured into adopting the curriculum and teaching according to the curriculum. Anybody want to take that one?
I would offer one very small comment, which is that when you offer a curriculum and you offer 2 or 3 options to harried teachers, they are not about to draft their own option. So one of the problems that I see is teachers are overwhelmed in terms of the demands, particularly given the environment that we're coming out of. And so the path of least resistance will be to take number 1 or maybe number 2. But no one is going to be doing the kind of work that we would love to see done to broaden out the type of lesson plan that would be of importance to the local community that they're serving. Again, part of this is to bring some inclusion for the students who perhaps feel marginalized or abandoned or don't identify with anything. So clearly the teacher has to be able to provide some of that guidance in the plan. But if there's no time to create a plan that fits that community, we'll take the first one that's available, and the recommendations are what we've heard. They're not.
I think that's exactly right, Mo. Thank you very much. I think that's exactly right. And in addition, I would say this is what gets back to that the ESMC is a roadmap. It spells out for teachers what the general direction is. That's why it's particularly important that we look at the entire piece. We look at the resources, we look at the citations, and most importantly, we look at the general principles and values that drive the whole thing. So teachers will take a look at that and then do what they will. It is true that you really cannot, it is almost impossible to prevent bad stuff from getting into the classroom. Bad teaching will happen, bad curricula will happen. What we're talking about though is to minimize the chances of it and maximize the chances of success.
Thank you guys. Another question comes in asking, how do we address pushback from our communities, especially from our own Jewish community, who feel that there is nothing wrong with this approach?
Well, I guess I'll take the Jewish one, and maybe others can mention.
But I think it could apply to any community.
Yeah, yeah, actually, I think what I'm about to say applies to everybody. So I'll just start, and then when you and Brandy and Mo, you can fill in. I think that the number one thing you can do is speak your mind. So one of the biggest dangers is groupthink that can happen in any society. As I mentioned, I grew up in a society that is very well known for it. I recently read 1984, by the way, that reminded me of what groupthink is all about. But the number one thing you can do is don't follow the groupthink and actually speak your mind, because the fewer of us say, oh, well, it's too late, or, oh, well, I can't convince them, then it'll just keep going. So share your thoughts within your community, share your thoughts with others outside of your community. Wen-Yun, do you want to add to that? Wen-Yun, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One thing is, like you said, Alina, a particular danger, and that's which is being encouraged by this curriculum and by the implementation of critical ethnic studies that's already going on in individual school districts is groupthink. And when we talk to people from within, both within and outside our communities, it's very important to highlight, the fundamental problems with both the model curriculum and the philosophy, the critical philosophy behind the model curriculum. And don't be afraid to speak your mind, speak up, speak your own mind. You'll be very surprised to find that you can probably find more allies than enemies when you speak up. Because we're not so different from each other. And like you said, Elena and Jill, most of the majority of Californians, regardless of ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, or political persuasions, should be opposing critical ethnic studies. This is not a Jewish problem. This is not an Asian problem. This is not an ethnic problem. This is a bridge issue. This is a policy issue that we should all be willing to openly discuss and challenge each other in public discourse. So,
one thing that I might offer in this regard is there's a very big danger of ageism in this conversation. There's this notion that somehow if you're 35 and under, or maybe even 50 and under, you've got it figured out. And if you're over 50, you're from another world. And so one of the things that I've tried to do to empower myself to have those discussions is to read chapter and verse, how to be an anti-racist, to read chapter and verse, what is white fragility. So I'm not just going to quote Martin Luther King's great narratives, but I can also quote some of the misconceptions that are being promoted, or even Isabel Wilkerson's caste system that tries to label America alongside South Africa and Nazi Germany. There are things that really go way beyond this soft critical race theory narrative in the classroom that are rooted in very strong divisions and hatred. And so for me, when I'm going to have that conversation, it's not going to be out of ignorance or out of a sense that I know better because I did this. It's because, okay, I haven't taken the courses, but I've read the books and I've listened to the podcasts. And I sit down and listen to Glenn Lowry or Ian McWhirter from Columbia University, who are two Black spokesmen who are magnificent in conveying the same things that Brandy was just talking to us about. And it gives me tremendous encouragement to stand up to this notion of, well, just be a sheep and roll over. And it's okay because, like I said earlier, you have no grandchildren and you're an old man. Why would you ever want this conversation? It's not because I'm right. It's because there is right and there is wrong. And, one of the organizations that I've discovered recently is—
Mo, I'm really sorry, Mo. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
We just have so many questions to go through. And I think that there are tons of people that would love to hear from you as well. So I think we'll be forwarding many of them to you. In addition, we could probably listen to you for hours and hours, but I think we better go on to a few more questions.
So a couple of real quick ones here. I would like to just say, somebody wrote in that it's a form of intimidation to say it's too late. For those who are wondering, in this last moment, should you keep fighting? And the answer is yes. Another person asked, assuming private schools don't have to adopt this curriculum, that's not a good assumption. And here is why. There is another bill in the legislature that would make this course a requirement for admission to the UC system, to any of the UC universities. And if that happens, you will expect this course will be required all over the country, because no high school, public or private or parochial, wants to tell its students that they cannot apply to a UC school because they don't offer the courses that would be necessary. So indirectly, yes, this will impact the private schools as well. Another question is, I think we've talked about the teachers unions.
Jill, Jill, there was one that I saw that was on something that Brandy was talking about, which was how do you tell the difference between education and indoctrination? And Brandy addressed that very early on. So I have to say I struggle with that one sometimes because some of it is intuitive. So Brandy, maybe you can take that one.
I think there are a couple of questions you can ask yourself. One, with indoctrination, a question I ask is, can I tell the political leanings of the educator? And if I know the political leanings of the educators, there's a chance that even if it's not explicit, if it's implicit, there's going to be a push for students to adopt the side of their teacher. There's an intimidation factor there. And the other part is learning for what? Are you learning for facts? What happened? The good, the bad, and the ugly? Or are you learning because the goal of the educator is to sway students to move in a particular direction along a particular social movement? And those are just a couple. I'm going to be brief because I know we're running out of time, but those are a couple of ways that you can kind of tell the difference between education or indoctrination.
Alina, I don't know if you know this one. There's a question. What is the title of the textbook with the anti-Zionist perspective?
I do. You know what? I'm going to put it in the, if I can find it quickly, I will put it in the chat. If not, then please email calastudies@gmail.com and we'll send it to you. And unfortunately, I think, unless we have a quick question, Jill, do we have one quick one?
A lot of these are very
Just long, okay.
Well, they're not quick questions. They're
Okay.
long, thoughtful questions.
So I think we're gonna turn it over to Jill just to wrap up, and just a reminder that I didn't put in the link, so I'm going to do that now so that you can see where you can go ahead and do the action alert. So Jill.
Yeah, so first of all, I'd like to thank our four panelists. They've done a phenomenal job and given us very clear insight into perspectives that are both different, but also very much the same. I think what you heard is coming from four distinctly different perspectives. They ended up in the same place, which is there's great potential for this curriculum, but it's not currently on the right track. And we need to work together to not to eliminate ethnic studies, but to strengthen ethnic studies and make it a meaningful course that will empower students to succeed, not debilitate them through teaching them victimhood or demoralize them by teaching them that they are oppressors. So it can be a very unifying curriculum. We thank you for sticking with us for this evening. I know everyone is very busy. Please go to our website. Please send letters and forward our information to as many people as you can. Encourage them to send letters. It does make a difference. The incremental improvements that we've made to now have been because we've been able to get literally thousands and thousands of letters sent in. Please call in on the 18th and speak up if you are able to do that and can work in your schedule. But stay tuned because this will not be over. There may be a curriculum adopted at the end of March. The deadline may be extended, but either way, this challenge will continue school district to school district. And it is, unfortunately, we will have to meet that challenge in each and every one of those places to do the best we can to protect the education for the next generation and prevent the what seems to be brainwashing of danger of the critical approach to the curriculum. So with that, I thank you.
I also wanted, I just wanted to give one quick shout out and thanks to Jill herself, who had to manage a motley crew and technology and all sorts of issues. So thank you so much, Jill, for managing us and moderating for us. And Don't forget to go to the website where you can also learn how you can support our work financially. And thank you so much to all of our panelists and to all of you for listening.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.